Well, welcome back to First Grade Bible. This is part two, and we left off with the uh, people of the offspring of Abraham, the tribes of Israel, living in Egypt. And at first, that was a great situation, but as they multiplied, they began to create a sort of paranoia among the Egyptians, and their response, first of all, was slavery. They began to put these Israelites into hard labor. And then, as the multiplication continued, they began a program of genocide. And it was in that situation into which a child was born by the name of Moses. Moses had a rather exciting, strange, eventful life, beginning when he was a baby. He was rescued by the daughter of Pharaoh. Pharaoh was the top man in Egypt, equivalent to a king, or almost a god. And Pharaoh's daughter adopted Moses, and he grew up in the courts of Pharaoh. But as a young man, he got into trouble, and he left Egypt, fled Egypt, went east into the Sinai area, which is a sort of peninsula that juts down into the Red Sea. And he met his wife. He worked for his father-in-law as a shepherd. And it was there that he repeated that pattern. He had an experience, an encounter with God. He was tending his father-in-law's sheep, and he saw up on a mountainside a strange sight, a bush that was on fire, but it wasn't burning up. And so Moses went up to investigate, and the Lord spoke to Moses out of that bush. And at that burning bush, Moses was called into a very important role. He was called by God to go to Egypt, and he was to lead the people out of Egypt, the Israelite people, and rescue them from their slavery. And so Moses did that. Again, I'm skipping so much material, all sorts of intriguing events that took place. But the final result of that is that the Israelite people were led by Moses out of their homes, and they ended up on the shore of the Red Sea. And there they are at the Red Sea, and behind them is the Egyptian army. They're in trouble. They're cornered. And suddenly, God intervenes, and the sea parts and leaves a path of dry land. And the Israelites walk across that dry land to the area of Sinai. The Egyptian army attempts to follow them, and when they do, the water comes back together, and that's the end of the Egyptian army. And so the people now are free. They have been rescued by God under the leadership of Moses. Moses then leads them to a mountain called Mount Sinai. And there they stay for about a year. And some really important stuff goes on at Mount Sinai. First of all, they hear God speak 10 words, as the Hebrew language calls it, what we know of as the 10 Commandments. And so that sort of set the groundwork for a longer and more extended instruction in how to live that the Israelites would come to call the law of Moses. And this law instructed them in all sorts of issues and situations in their lives. I have observed, of course, that from the New Testament viewpoint, the law kind of gets a bad rap. And we won't go into that, why that was true. But most Christians sort of have a jaundiced understanding of the Mosaic law. But I believe that sometimes we need to have a different twist on the law, a little different understanding. And I believe that one of the things that we need to see in the law is that God is interested in every nook and cranny of our lives. How do we treat our neighbor? How do we treat our wives or our husbands? How do we treat our servants? How do we treat our animals? What do we think about money? What do we think about our neighbor's money? All of these things and many more, all are covered by the law. Because God is saying, every part of your life is of interest to me. Every part of your life is important. And so that's the message they got from the Mosaic law. Now, then, in addition to this, during that year's stay at Sinai, they received instructions about worship of God. And included in that instruction was a place to worship. And this came to be called the Tabernacle. It was really a tent. And it was portable. It could be folded up. The stakes and so forth could be carried. And as they moved, and after all, they were not in a permanent place, and they packed up their tents, they could pack up the tabernacle tent and take it with them. And then when they unpacked their tents and set them up, they also could pitch God's tent. In the midst of their encampment, there was a tent for God. And so the message was God was with them. God was traveling with them, and they could experience worship of God in the tabernacle as they moved from place to place. So we find that God, first of all, rescued these people. He formed a relationship with them that he was their God and they were his people. He gave them the law. He instructed them about the tabernacle and about worship. But they lacked one thing. They didn't have a home. They didn't have a land. But God gave them a promised land. There was a place where they were going. And of course that was the land of Canaan. And they were headed there, but it took them 40 years. It would have been a matter of weeks at the most for them to move to Canaan, but for various important circumstances, they ended up sort of wandering in the wilderness, making a very circuitous route, and they were there for 40 years in the wilderness. They finally end up on the east side of the Jordan River, which is sort of the major eastern boundary of the land of Canaan. And they could look across and see the promised land. Now, Moses had been their leader throughout that 40-year period. But Moses had sinned in a special way that disqualified him from leading them into the promised land. Moses was able to go up on the mountain and get a look, but he was not allowed to enter the promised land. And so we find that the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, end there at the eastern side of the Jordan River, and Moses died there, and it would be up to a new leader to lead them into the promised land. And thus ends the 5 books of Moses.